All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. Really excited to co-present during today's session around letting data speak and using analytics to kind of guide every stage of game development, release, improvement, iteration. My name is Peter Bailis. I'm the founder and CEO of Sisu, which is a company dedicated to helping you understand why your key metrics from engagement to activation and retention are changing over time. Really excited to be here today, joined by Stephan Sherman, who is the co-founder and CTO of Bazooka Tango. Stephan is one of the co-founders of Evil Megacorp and one of the creators of the wildly successful Vainglory series. I'm really excited personally from the data perspective to be here with him today, and that shortly after raising a massive round of funding just a few months ago, this quote kind of lit up for me. As I said in their kind of press release, at Bazooka Tango, we saw a real opportunity to be a lot more scientific about the way we approach building games and the way that we approach thinking about the market. And this kind of blend between, the art of game development and then the science of data science and analytics and blending these is just like a really interesting, I think, kind of conversation to have, especially in today's environment at GDC, where there's, so much increased demand in mobile gaming and digital experiences. And really excited to have this conversation with you today, Stephan, about what you've learned in your past gig, what you're learning in your new gig, and how to really blend these two, kind of the science with the art. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter.
Maybe just to kick us off, can you share a little bit about your background and kind of your path to get to where you are today and some of the challenges that you're working on at Bazooka Tango in particular?
Sure. Again, hi, my name is Stephan Sherman. I've been working in video games for, I think maybe 15 or 20 years now. That makes me feel old. The most recent video game that you guys know me for is, of course, Vainglory, which was one of the first mobile esports. It was launched in 2016 and was, by all metrics, quite successful product. I worked with a team of highly creative individuals. I was a co-founder of Evil Megacorp at the time. Prior to that, I've worked at a variety of different game dev studios on both console, PC, mobile titles. I worked at Riot Games for a while on League of Legends. I worked at Stormfront Studios earlier in my career on a variety of man, that was the PS2, Xbox era. I worked at Foundation 9, which previously was called The Collective. So I've been lucky to have quite a few game dev studios and products in my backlog prior to starting Evil Megacorp with my co-founders then. And now I am spearheading with one of my co-founders a new endeavor called Bazooka Tango, and this is the ultimate marriage of the science and the artistry of making video games. And fingers crossed, we're going to have our first product in the channel later on this year, and hopefully you guys will be as excited about it as we are right now.
That's awesome. And thanks for joining us today. I'm curious, when you online, I saw Bazooka Tango's stated goal is to build the world's most engaging, immersive, and impactful experiences. And as both kind of a game developer and a player, what does that actually mean to you? How does it play out?
So first, when we're talking about the most immersive and impactful, impact is really the word I think that we use a lot in our vernacular. It was coined by a buddy of mine, but it resonated really strongly with the team. The idea of impact is a combination of the total number of players that are playing your game combined with the total amount of revenue that your product is earning. We want to have a success metric that is a combination of both. And there's a lot of studios, I think, that are more comfortable winning one of those two metrics without the other. If you think about the indie scene, there's a lot more interest in just making sure that your product is experienced far more than that your product earns revenue. And then the mobile scene, it shifts the other direction where earning the revenue is really the key. But we want a combination of both. And we admire the studios that have been, hyper successful in creating impact and creating products that a lot of players play across the world and that earn revenue for it, which is incredibly difficult to do in mobile. Earning revenue is quite a black art, one that we are continuing to learn as we go on. So that's what we think of.
In revenue, obviously keeps the lights on, but then the engagement keeps the players going, right? So how do you actually think about almost culturally for say an early team like Bazooka Tango building that focus on balancing these two in from kind of the DNA of the company in an early studio?
Yeah, it's there was a phrase that I heard that stuck with me. We don't make video games to make money, but we need to make money to make video games. And the reality of the business of video games is super important to make sure that the revenue, especially in a product market like mobile where things are free, that you have a steady revenue stream coming in from the products, because you're definitely going to be spending the money on running the products. And we make a lot more action-oriented kinds of games, which means we have live servers that are constantly on, and your server costs are going to be significantly more, dramatically more, like orders of magnitude more than a game that's like an idle game or single-player game or games that don't rely on heavy back-end infrastructure. So for those products specifically, you have to make sure that you have a clear revenue stream coming in. And so making sure that that's part of it was where the science of making games came in with the artistry of making games. Like, we love the artistry part. That's really the fun. But if you can't capture that last part, you don't get to do this part much. Your artistry very much depends on you being able to earn revenue.
Yeah, I imagine that change also kind of, that balance shifts over time.
Yes.
So can you talk to me a little about kind of the role of data where you are today, where you're getting ready to launch, first product in market, compared to where you were at Evil Megacorp, kind of scaling up, right? How does that balance evolve over time, and what does that mean for kind of the team in the way in which you kind of rally your team as a development team behind metrics, revenue, engagement, otherwise?
Yeah. So the first choice that's confronted by any dev studio when they're going to put a product into channel is what product you're going to make, and that is the first time that data makes a big impact on what you choose. Popularity is easy. You'll see a lot of products that become what we call genre kings. These are standout products that define a specific genre. When you think of a genre, they immediately come to mind. The genre king for the MOBA market is League of Legends. The genre king for what used to be the MMO market was World of Warcraft. But every single genre tends to have a singular title that people think of as having defined the genre and sort of anchored it to what it has become. The genre king titles are typically the titles that other people are going to try to chase. You're going to try to think, okay, is there a way for us to be able to improve on what's been established? Extend the expectations of players, create a new experience that they haven't felt before. And a lot of times, how you pick your first product is a combination of that art and that science coming together. So, for example, you want to make sure that your product has as wide of an appeal as humanly possible. If you're making a product that's going to be a worldwide product, you have to not just appeal to players that are here in the US, but also players that are in Southeast Asia, players that are in Russia, players that are in Australia, and the cultural differences between each of those societies actually becomes incredibly important when you're sitting down to think about what that product can be. Tastes and sensibilities are very, very different between these different countries. You do want to make sure that you appeal strongly to some country. It's not so important that you appeal to every country, but you definitely have to get some of the big ones in there for your product to be successful. And that's a bit of a combination with what you think your dev team can do a good job with. So, obviously we live in the US, so we're very much more used to Western titles, and we think that we can create them far better than we could, say, anime or Eastern titles, in which our sensibilities might seem a bit foreign for native gamers that are in those countries. So you're trying to choose, okay, how do you create a product that you think is going to have as broad of an appeal as possible? The moment that you thought of your broad appeal, then you want to try to test that with data. And this is where our VP of marketing has done a phenomenal job for us. You just start throwing out content. These are pictures, words, ideas, anything that you have, and you put them in front of people, and you judge how strongly they react. If you're not getting strong reactions from early indications of what your product is going to be, don't continue down that road. it is incredibly important that you scrap ideas early before they've gotten super expensive. You might think you want to make a product out of, I don't know, cowboys versus ninjas, but if people out there don't want to play that product and you put it in front of a bunch of people and they're just kind of like, then you should step away, rethink, maybe cowboys and ninjas isn't the thing to do. So that's what the first appearance of data. After that, it becomes even more of a testing churn. You put as much in front of other players or potential players as you possibly can. Once you're actually crafting the heroes themselves, the players are gonna play, you put those in front of testers. As soon as you can, you try to collect as much data as possible, because the first part of creating the product, the CPI, which is called cost per install, is going to be driven by how much initial appeal that you've crafted with these early testing plans that you create with these testers.
That's awesome. And I guess, for many of the folks watching this content, maybe they've already got something in market, and maybe the easiest way to generate that revenue from an investment perspective is to leverage the investment you've already made. So I got a game, it's in market. Maybe it's, going gangbusters. Maybe it's, doing okay. Like what should, from your perspective, having kind of been on that rocket ship trajectory and building out that future rocket ship trajectory at Bazooka Tango, what should the day in the life of a game developer look like in from a studio perspective, in terms of looking at the data and actually acting on that data? Like, what are the metrics we should be looking at? And from almost an organizational and process perspective, what should we be doing?
Well, it's going to be different at different phases of your product. And your product life cycle is going to have its sunrise, it's going to have its midday, and it's going to have its sunset. Eventually, your product is for better or worse, you're going to want to retire and put it out to pasture. So depending on of where you are in your product life cycle, you want to do different things. If your product is not yet released, meaning that there are no gamers that are outside of the studio that has made that product playing that product, then the data that you're collecting is much more on the marketing side. It's about how much appeal that you think your product is going to have, like we just discussed. Once your product is in front of testers or players, testers are typically alpha testers, beta testers. These are players that are external to your studio. They shouldn't be in the four walls of your studio, but they're external to your studio, but they're playing your product and they're giving you guys feedback about it. What's broken, what's good, what's not. Once it's in front of people that are outside of you, the kind of things that you're looking for is, from your testers, you're looking for bugs and general overall entertainment and appeal. Your testers are going to play your game all the time, so you don't really have to worry about how much they want to open the app and come back to the app, which is called retention. But they will tell you about how much the game is, how fun the game is to play, and whether or not they're having a good time or whether things are broken. For your players, these are no longer testers. These are people that can play your game. They're external to your studio, but these players have no incentive to actually play your game. The moment there's no incentive to playing your game, you start getting real data, because they're starting to model what your public is going to do writ large. So from those testers, you want to try to be able to figure out, okay, what are we looking at for retention? And so for when we launch a product, we try to find a territory being a country or a small set of countries that are in a common region that we think that we can deploy the game to. We pick a territory, we deploy the game to that territory, and then we try to get metrics based off of how popular the game is to those players. The metrics for those are going to be things like your what are called the D1, the D3, the D7, and the D30. Those are how many players that once they've downloaded your game, do you see them come back and play your game 24 hours later? That's your D1. 72 hours later is your D3, your D5, your D7, etc. You're trying to figure out how many players continue to come back on those days and play. And you're going to see that percentage is going to keep dropping. It's going to, and it's okay that it drops. You're going to start at 100% for your D1, for your D0, and then your D1, you're going to have a pretty big fall off. And if you're lucky, your D1, a healthy D1, is going to be above 35% or so. If you can see 35% returning 24 hours later to play your game, then your game is doing pretty good. 40% and above, and you're in a really good spot. This means, you can actually earn revenue from the game that is worth keeping the lights on, etc. If your D1 is looking like you're in the 15% or the 20%, if you're or heaven forbid the single digits, then at that point you need to be thinking about either dramatic surgery to the product itself, switching to a different territory because perhaps the product appeals to somebody in Russia where it wouldn't appeal to somebody in Australia, or you're going to end up scrapping the product altogether and trying to recoup your losses. So making sure that before you even get too deep into your game, that your D1, your D3, and your D7 are looking really healthy is super, super key. That's going to tell you that the game has legs and that you can make money off of it.
Awesome. And yeah, so it sounds like from a metrics perspective, ultimately going down to revenue and engagement. And then I can also imagine, depending on my game, if I'm building a mobile game like Vainglory, there's specific Vainglory specific features that I might be tracking, who's playing which characters, are different demographics playing different characters. It's also, am I winning and losing? Is the game balanced? There's all these different ways to kind of cut this and slice and dice this. I'm curious, how do I go about the process of understanding, okay, if I've got a gap between D3 and D7, then I know I'm not keeping those users for long in the first 3 days. I want to figure out, how do I boost that? I've got all these different knobs at my disposal, everything from, like I said, changing the market, changing the product, changing my game mechanics. How do I decide, right? Like, how does this, my sense of this is where some of the art and science, and you're smiling, sort of start to come together, but what's that process look like? How do I use the data I've got while also recognizing that it's not a representative sample necessarily, and there's too many places to go?
Yeah. So the early life cycle of your user is, the first, getting that first 7 days is critical. And the beats that they go through, the milestones that they experience in those first 7 days is super, super important, because you're trying to create a habit. The hope is that your game ultimately is habit forming. You want a person to learn how to open the app and then return to the app cyclically until after 7 to 14 days, they're just doing it all the time. And if you can keep a person past your 90 to 180 day mark, then you've really got a chance to be able to monetize them effectively and make sure you guys can keep the lights on and make another game, which is what everybody hopes to do. So making those choices in the first 7 is going to differ a little bit based off of the genre of the kind of game that you make. If you're making a puzzle game or an action game, the kind of offers or the kind of engagement that you're going to put into your product is going to be a little bit different. For the games that we made, for action style games, a lot of what players like, what appeals to them early on, tends to be finding things that are very signature to them. Maybe a hero that appeals to them, or a specific gameplay style that they find fun. Challenge, but challenge in which they feel like it is possible to overcome, which is a delicate balancing act to try to strike. And then specifically rewards. There are things that that you can dangle in front of players early on that makes them feel invested in the product, because the sunk cost fallacy is a real thing. If players feel that they have gained some value in the first few days of your product, they'll tend to want to stick with that product. So you've seen this before. If you've played mobile games, a lot of them will have this the 7-day login track, in which they're gonna if you stick around for the 7th day, then you get something amazing. There's all sorts of rewards that they're going to drop on early players to make sure that they feel good. But that the feeling good part is really important. The player has to feel like they are triumphant in those first 7 days. They have to feel like that they can win at this game before the game gets overly challenging. So beyond tutorialization, which will happen in your D1 era, once you're getting to your D3, like to your example, to your D3 to D7, you're really getting out of tutorialization for the player, and you're getting into the phase in which the player should feel cyclical moments of triumph, but still extended moments of challenge. Challenge and triumph as a balancing act, very difficult to get right. And again, going to be specific to the game that you have, but it would be thinking through exactly what moments of hooray are players feeling in the D3 to the D7 to make sure that they want to experience that again.
Right. And one of the challenges I can imagine is measuring triumph seems hard, right? Unless you've got a EKG hooked up to someone, probably not going to get that signal. So I'm curious in terms of kind of like, maybe counterintuitive lessons or pitfalls that you've seen in terms of trying to blend, these quantitative measures with more emotional, qualitative, artistic measures. What have you seen that both works and maybe, hasn't worked so well in terms of putting the data plus the player experience together in this type of science meets art?
Yeah. So this has happened a lot, and even is confronting us now at Bazooka Tango. The first product that we're making out of Bazooka Tango is a reimagining of Vainglory called Vainglory All Stars. in which the gameplay style is dramatically different. We move it out of the MOBA genre. We try to remix it into something completely new that we think is going to be super exciting. One of the things that happens a lot is that players have a general craving for power and whatever specific hero that they tend to love. And they don't think about the ecosystem and holistically nearly as much as they try to think about what drives them uniquely. And so one of the things that you end up having to do with combining the data and the feedback is that, you know, from each of the points of feedback, you can hear what they like. But the most important thing that you're trying to create is a theme park, essentially, a universally appealing product for everyone. So you never want to do a thing that's just going to potentially, you know, appeal to a small player base segment that is going to end up harming your larger player base. When it comes to balance, you'll see this happen a lot with the heroes that we had to do in Vainglory. Sometimes players would want certain heroes to be a lot stronger, but that would create what we would call toxic environments, heroes that would create more frustration than they would create appeal. So when we talked a lot about game design in Vainglory, we talked a lot about player frustration. Triumph, what we were just discussing, these high moments, is it has to be mitigated against frustration. If someone's triumph costs someone else frustration, or hopefully not, more people frustration than it gave them triumph, then you're getting a net loss in the ecosystem of how much entertainment you're providing in your product. If one person can run around in God mode and 5 people are going to hate that person, then that is not great for your product, no matter how much that one person wants to be in God mode. So there's this constant like balancing act there. Now, when it comes to the data itself, on Vainglory, for example, we collected win rates for all of our heroes, and we had those stratified across the ELO band. And ELO is the way that we end up measuring the skill of every single one of our players. The majority of players are pretty average in their ELO skill, and then you have a ever narrowing funnel where players get very, very skillful towards the top end. And we're balancing the heroes for the appeal across that entire ELO band. We want to find their win rates in each one of those, and then talk to the players and hear their experiences and figure out how to tune them such that they have basically a 50-50 win rate across all of those ELO bands. Very difficult to do, but you know, if you collect enough data, you can kind of start seeing the trends emerge. And we were lucky enough that we had some skillful ninjas at Super Evil, and we managed to make it happen.
Nice, and that kind of leveling of the ELO band gets you the ability to kind of appeal to this incredibly wide range of people who are getting into mobile gaming. There's almost the golden age of mobile gaming. So you can get the competitive all the way to the casual. And I guess in that sense, I'm curious from a game design perspective, sorry, from a metric design perspective, let's say I get the ELO flat. The engagement level I would expect, and the engagement metrics I would expect from competitive gamers to be drastically different than a casual gamer. And I'm curious when you think about you know, setting up an engagement target or a metric for engagement, how you think about stratifying those across these classes or archetypes of players, and how you decide, you know, do I try to increase engagement on casuals and try to flip them to regular? Do I want to try to increase competitive? Do I get most of my actual revenue from competitive because it drives eyeballs in tournaments? Like, how does that play out? And because obviously you're gonna have an order of magnitude difference in daily play time between, you know, one of the spectrum and the other.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there are some of it for Vainglory. It was unique in that, you know, we had a wide roster of heroes, and we could use that wide roster of heroes to create some heroes that we thought were going to appeal to people in the high end of the ELO band, and some that we were going to appeal to the more casual of the players. And so, you know, once we would flag certain heroes as appealing to more casual players, we wouldn't try to, you know, balance them necessarily for high ELO play. It might be the kind of hero you would graduate out of deciding to play as you got better and better at the game. But it would still be there because it was hyper appealing to the players that were new and coming in. Overall, most of the time, our methodology for Vainglory was that we wanted to ensure that the high level players were satisfied. We didn't want to sacrifice our casual for it, but with MOBAs and for hyper skillful games, part of the appeal to a lot of the players is that they have these representations, these other players that are amazing at it, these almost celebrity esports players that they want to emulate. And And that sense of celebrity it was super important for Vainglory to drive the casual market, because even though 99% of our players would never be these celebrity esport players, they would all look up to them and they would all watch their videos. They would all want to be them, and they would continue to play our game because they would want to practice. That drive to practice and to improve was the fundamental flywheel that drove Vainglory. So we wanted to make sure that our high level players were satisfied. So that's how it worked for Vainglory. In games that aren't that hyper skillful, though, you're going to have a little bit more of a balancing act. For engagement in general, the time on app is a great metric to measure. This is given a single 24-hour period and a player that plays your game. When they open your app, from the moment they open the app until the moment they decide to close the app, how much time did they spend? And if you can increase that number, you will also increase, revenue and popularity and lots of things like, your matchmaking times will go down. And there's so many benefits to getting that high that, thinking through ways of doing that is super important, especially if you have an action game. We had a lot of interesting things that we introduced as Vainglory went along to see if we could stimulate that. And we did great. Vainglory, it had an average playtime of 90 minutes, which on mobile was unheard of for players in a 24-hour period.
And I'm curious, one of the things you have talked about pretty publicly is a lot of the shifts occurring in mobile gaming at large. And I'm curious, if you look at mobile industry as a whole, how do you see these kind of trends playing out across, not only kind of upstart game studios, but, broadly, even at the, largest scales in terms of people's attitudes towards data and kind of the opportunities to use data more broadly?
I think most studios now, and maybe it's always been that way, but you don't see it as much when you're on the console side. The way that you do data and analytics on console is just very different, because the market is very, very different. But most studios now have a pretty established data department. They're going to have product guys that are going to be ninjas at being able to collect this data, analyze trends, and be able to talk about the life cycle and the performance of a product. I think the trick is less about whether or not there's a secret sauce to doing data, and it's more that data has to be thought of as essential. I think for the studios that are successful, they have found a way to create a process of crafting games in which the data is one of the legs of the tripod. If you think of game design as one leg of the tripod, data is one of those three legs, and you can't get away from including it as much as possible in every level of the choices that you make. And for us, we also make sure that we cross specific gates before we would put a product into channel. So we have these things called KPIs, key performance indicators, which are basically a high level way of describing some aspect of the health of a product, things that you would want the product to succeed at. Maybe you want your D1 to be, I don't know, above 40%. You could say D1 above 40%. That is a KPI. It is one of the indicators that measures performance on your product. So we set up a bunch of these KPIs beforehand, and we use these as metrics to determine, as a business, is this going to be a healthy product for us to be able to put out and support? Because once again, if we're making action games, we're going to be spending a lot on the servers, and the servers are really going to be the thing that's going to dictate it. So we do our best to try to find a way to balance our KPIs and the analytics that we take at every single one of those phases, from the sunrise to the midday to the sunset of every single product, to ensure the product is in fact healthy and produces revenue for the company.
Awesome. No, this is super helpful. And one final question as a kind of last word: what's the guidance you would give to new developers if you give them one piece of advice around blending this art with the science?
I'd say the most important piece of advice is to install your analytics into your product from the get-go. Don't wait. Don't make it the last thing that you do. Talk about it in tandem. Make it a three-legged race with the game design. Every time you're having conversations about game design, you should be having conversations about the analytics that go with it. You should measure everything. If you can measure it, do it. There's nothing wrong with doing it. Always do it. It'll help you in the long run. You'll be very happy that you did.
Awesome. So you heard it here first. Measure everything, from someone who's seen mega success, building another mega success. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed the conversation, Stephan, and really excited for next game to hit channel. We'll stay tuned for Vainglory All-Stars.
Thank you, Peter.